The planet did not have a proper name. It had a catalogue number, Verarak 9, Union Survey Division, filed under geologically inert. No commercial value, no habitation potential, no further assessment required. 14 words. That was the entire written history of Verarak 9, as far as the Union was concerned. Marcus Hale figured that made 2 of them, he brought the mule down through the upper atmosphere just before local dawn, which didn't mean much, because Verarak 9 didn't have a sun worth the title, just a pale smear of light behind permanent cloud cover, a kind of grey that didn't change from morning to afternoon to night. The planet existed in one long, colourless exhale, ash and compressed rock, the occasional scar in the crust where something old had burned. No trees, no water, no wind. Nothing had happened here in a very long time. Marcus liked that about it. A mule was not a pretty ship. She was Union surplus, a heavy salvage rig built 41 years ago to strip ore out of asteroid fields, retrofitted twice, patched 3 times with parts that didn't quite match. She made a low rhythmic clunk from the port stabilizer that Marcus had stopped noticing 6 months ago. The air inside smelled like recycled oxygen and instant coffee and the faint chemical bite of suit seals. There was a crack in the co-pilot seat where the padding had split. Hyde taped it. The tape had started peeling. He hadn't fixed it. He sat in the pilot's chair and watched the surface come up to meet him on the forward display. Humanity had been a member of the Union for 62 years. It had been granted exactly 1 salvage classification, Tier 9. The lowest tier, the tier reserved on paper for provisional species with unverified operational discipline. In practice, it meant humans got the sites nobody else wanted, filed the most paperwork per credit earned of any licensed species in the compact apartment, and answered to review boards staffed entirely by species who had never once had their competence questioned in writing. Marcus had been doing this for 12 years. In that time, he had accumulated 41 compliance citations. Most of them were nothing. A manifest timestamp 90 seconds off, a fuel declaration rounded the wrong direction. He remembered every one of them the way you remember the terms of a contract you signed, because you didn't have a choice. He remembered citation 19 the clearest, because it was the one that had actually cost him something. He'd pulled a wreck out of the Alenia debris field 2 years back, a research skiff with no beacon and no registered owner, and he'd filed the recovery within the standard 6-hour window, 5 hours and 51 minutes, by his own log. The review board's copy of his log showed 6 hours and 4 minutes. Nobody could explain the discrepancy. Nobody was required to. The board didn't accuse him of falsifying anything. I simply noted, in the flat administrative language reserved for cases like his, that the burden of temporal accuracy rests with the licensee, regardless of originating cause, and fined him 3 months of salvage rights on any site within the Alenia Compact. He hadn't argued. Arguing cost more than paying did, and everyone at Tier 9 learned that arithmetic early, or they didn't stay at Tier 9 long enough to learn much else. What he'd never said out loud, not even to Cho, was that he'd checked the station's own relay logs afterward, quietly, off the record, and found a 13-minute clock drift on the station's side. Not his. He had the data. He had never filed it. Filing it meant opening a new case, and a new case meant another 11 months of his life, spent proving something the system had no actual desire to hear. So he'd let it go, the way you let go of 100 small unfairnesses a year, because carrying all of them at once would have meant not doing the job at all. He was not thinking about any of that when the scanner changed its tone. The terrain pass had been routine. Rock, more rock, a ridge system along the eastern quarter, pressed and fractured like something enormous had pressed down on it a long time ago. Metal detector had come up quiet everywhere, except one patch near that ridge. I'd found trace deposits before, iron, mostly compressed nickel. Once on a moon near the Kessa border, a decent cache of titanium alloy that had bought 4 months of fuel. A permit. This wasn't that kind of reading. He looked at it again. The reading was not trace. He did not know yet that 11 weeks from that morning, a fact, on a colony he had never visited, a girl named Nadia Calloway would run out of medicine because 2 union directorates couldn't agree on a signature. He did not know that his answer to what he found today would end up standing between her name and every name that came after it. Right now, he only knew the number on the scanner was wrong, and that he wanted to know why. He set the mule down 2 kilometers from the ridge, close enough to walk, far enough that if something went wrong, he'd have time to think about it on the way back. He suited up in the airlock. Verarak 9 had atmosphere, technically, not the kind you breathed for long. He stepped out onto the surface, and the ash crunched under his boots, each print sharp-edged. Away, footprints hold in dry powder when there's no wind to soften them. He was the first thing that had walked here in a long time. Maybe. The first thing ever. He didn't let himself think about that. He walked. The ridge was bigger up close. Ridges always are. What had looked, on the scanner, like a compressed formation resolved as he got nearer into something more deliberate, curves instead of breaks, angles that repeated too regularly to be geology. He stopped walking. He stood still, the old habit left over from mine surveys, where the ground sometimes moved. His breath was loud in the suit. The ridge wasn't a ridge, it was an edge. He stepped back and looked up, and his visor auto-adjusted for the flat light, and he saw the shape of it, enormous, half buried under what had to be 100,000 years of ash and collapsed rock. The leading edge of something vast and dark, rising out of the surface, like the prow of a drowned ship, pressing up through shallow water. The exposed sections were smooth, not worn smooth, built smooth, dark grey, with a faint iridescent sheen that matched no Union alloy in his memory. He'd studied precursor vessels the way salvagers study things they will never touch. Theory, dimensions, the 3 confirmed sites in Union space, all of them stripped clean by the Science Directorate and sealed off before anyone independent got within sensor range. This was not a stripped site, this was intact. He stood there for what was probably 3 minutes. He said, out loud to no one, a word he didn't remember choosing. Hold. Then he started walking the length of it, telling himself he was assessing. Hat was the professional behavior, that was the trained behavior. He had a scanner, he was taking readings. Heidi. He was filing them mentally for the report he would absolutely submit to the appropriate authority under Salvage Statute 12 and its 17 subsections, which he had read exactly once and remembered anyway. The scale kept resetting on him. A section his brain filed as a door-sized rectangle turned out against the terrain to be the size of a Union cruiser's hangar bay. He checked the number and checked it again, and it came out the same both times. 14 kilometers of exposed hull. The largest warship in current Union service was 3.2 kilometers. Marcus had seen one once, in orbit above a Kessa shipyard, and it had stopped conversation on the observation deck for a full minute. This was 14, and the buried section, the part he could only guess at, from how the ridge system radiated outward in every direction, like the ground itself had rearranged to make room, was bigger than that. Heart. He found a place near what he guessed was the forward section, where the armor curved inward in a shape too smooth to be damaged. He put his gloved hand against it. It was warm, not the residual warmth of rock that remembers a star it hasn't been near in geological ages. Warm the way metal is warm, when there is power moving somewhere deep inside it. Warm like something alive. Resting, he pulled his hand back. The wall moved not far, not dramatically. A section the size of a large door drew inward and slid aside with a precision that made no sound at all. No hiss, no grind, nothing. And then there was a space where solid hull had been, dark inside. And a light came on, not a bright light, a soft, deep amber like firelight filtered through old glass. It lit a corridor exactly wide enough to walk through. Marcus looked at it. For a long time he thought about Salvage Statute 12. He thought about the enforcement cruiser that had impounded his last cargo over a 90-second timestamp. Hard. He thought about the review board and the administrator who had studied him the way you study something stuck to your boot. Hand asked, in the flat tone the Union kept in reserve specifically for humans, whether he understood the severity of what he'd done. I thought, about 12 years of being told, politely in writing, that he did not yet belong at the table. Then he walked into the ship, 6 systems away, on a colony called Tamsin's Reach. A woman named Raina Calloway was arguing with a wall screen. She had been arguing with it. For 19 minutes, the screen displayed the seal of the Union Frontier Health Directorate and a queue number that had not moved since she'd opened the call. "I need the antitoxin shipment released," she said for the 4th time. "I have the requisition number. I have the medical certification. I have 41 confirmed cases, and a mortality curve I can show you if someone will look at it." The response, when it came, was calm, reasonable, unhurried. "Your request has been logged under Frontier jurisdiction. However, the shipment in question originates from Kesh Directorate stores, and Kesh Directorate has classified Tamsin's Reach as a provisional settlement pending a boundary review. Across, Directorate medical releases require a joint signature from both authorities. The next scheduled joint session is in 11 weeks. 11 weeks, Raina said. "Correct. In the interim, we recommend supportive care and isolation protocols, which have been transmitted to your local clinic." Raina's daughter, Nadia, was 8 years old. She had a drawing of a fox taped to the wall beside her bed, done in 3 colors because the colony's ration of art supplies didn't stretch to more. She liked the number 7. For no reason anyone had ever gotten out of her. She had been running a fever. For 6 days, Raina worked the water reclamation plant on the colony's East Terrace, a job that had put her family on the settlement roster in the first place, back when Tamsin's Reach was still being marketed to union recruiters as a model of frontier self-sufficiency. She'd believed that marketing enough to bring a 6-year-old across 4 transit systems to live under a sky that took getting used to. Nadia had adjusted faster than her mother had. Kids usually did. The colony's clinic had one doctor, a Kessa physician, named Vren, who had volunteered for the frontier posting because it counted double toward a licensing requirement back home. Pined, and who had, to his credit, correctly diagnosed the outbreak within 18 hours of the first case. He had also correctly identified the treatment, correctly calculated the dosage, and correctly filed the requisition through every channel available to him. What he could not do, no matter how many times he refilled it, was make 2 directorates agree on a signature neither of them was in a hurry to provide. Nobody on the call knew any of that. Nobody had asked. Marcus's crew found out about Tamsin's Reach 9 days later. from a backdated relay bounced through 3 dead stations because the Union routed frontier medical alerts through the cheapest available channel. And the cheapest available channel was slow. Cho, the mule's engineer, was the one reading the report aloud in the ship's galley. Because Cho had a habit of reading bad news out loud instead of just handing people a screen, and Marcus had never asked him why. 41 cases at first count, Cho said. It's a bacterial strain, waterborne, treatable if you catch it early. They caught it early. They just couldn't get anyone to sign off on the cure. Sarah, the pilot, didn't look up from the console. How many dead so far? Report doesn't say. It's 9 days stale. Talia, who did the scanning and kept unofficially a ship's written record of everything they found. She said the thing nobody else wanted to say first. 11 weeks for a signature. Nobody answered that. There wasn't an answer that helped. Marcus was standing at the far end of the galley, not sitting, arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular. He had been inside the buried ship for 6 days by then. He had seen corridors that didn't end. He had seen a chamber with a ceiling he couldn't find with a handheld light. He had touched a wall and felt it answer. He had also, in that time, learned exactly one new fact about himself that he hadn't known before. That he could hold 2 enormous things in his head at once, and that neither one made the other smaller. He didn't tell the crew, not yet, what he was already starting to consider, that the ship behind him might be the only lever in known space heavy enough to move 11 weeks down to 11 hours. That thought had walked in on its own, uninvited, 3 days earlier, and he hadn't been able to walk it back out. "We're not equipped for a rescue run," Sarah said. "We're a salvage rig with 6 people and a cargo hold full of survey gear." "I know," Marcus said. "So what are we equipped for?" Marcus didn't answer right away. Behind him, through the mule's rear viewport, Verarak 9's ridgeline sat exactly where it had always sat. Patient, enormous, waiting, the way it had apparently been waiting for longer than any species currently filing paperwork about it had existed. "Give me the day," he said. "I want to go back down." The request Marcus filed with Union Salvage Compliance was, on its face, entirely correct. A high discovery of anomalous structure. Verarak 9 survey grid, requesting emergency classification review and independent assessment team. Priority flag attached due to scale and apparent precursor origin. He filed it through the proper channel. He attached his scanner logs. He cited the correct statute. He did, in every technical sense, exactly what 12 years of citations had trained him to do. The response took 4 days. "Your report has been received and logged under anomalous findings. The Tier 9 originating party. Per Compact Protocol, findings by Tier 9 license holders require secondary verification by a Tier 3 or higher surveying authority before classification review can proceed." The nearest available Tier 3 team is currently deployed on a mineral dispute in the Halvath cluster and is not expected to reach Verarak 9 for approximately 14 months. In the interim, the site has been flagged as restricted. Any further contact with the structure by unauthorized personnel will be treated as a violation of Statute 12. Subsection 9, regarding unlicensed precursor engagement. It was signed by a Kesh sub-registrar named Own, whose title was 3 lines long and whose actual authority, as far as Marcus could tell, began and ended at forwarding things to other desks. 14 months, Marcus read it twice. He thought about Raina Calloway, whom he had never met, reading a message that said 11 weeks, in exactly the same tone. This one said 14 months. A different desk, different directorate, same tool, Politeness used the way other people used a locked door. Not cruel, not even personal, just perfectly engineered to make sure nothing moved without somebody's permission. A hand, nobody with the power to give that permission, was in a hurry. Pyment. He did not know yet that the sub-registrar who signed that message had, 6 years earlier, personally advocated for raising Tier 9 species out of the lowest classification, and had been overruled by a council that outnumbered her 9-1. He would learn that later. It would not change what he did next. It would change how he felt about it. Nobody at Compliance was a villain in this. That was the part that made it worse. Owen was doing her job correctly. Inside a system built by people who had never once needed anyone's permission to move quickly for themselves. Marcus closed the message. He tried, once, to go over Owen's head, because that was the correct next step, and he was still, at that point, trying to do this correctly. He filed an escalation to the Compacts Assessment Directorate, requesting an exception to the Tier 3 verification requirement, given what he described, carefully, as findings of unprecedented scale and possible strategic significance. The Directorate's reply took 6 days, and came from an official named Threll, whose message opened with a genuine, almost warm acknowledgement that the site sounded significant, and then spent 4 paragraphs explaining, with real regret audible under the procedure, that an exception of the kind Marcus was requesting had to originate from a member in good standing with the Compact's senior tiers, opined that Tier 9 licensees were not, under the current charter, eligible to originate exception requests, only to support one filed by someone who was. Who's eligible to file one for me? Marcus asked on the follow-up call, because Threll had at least stayed on the line long enough for a follow-up call. Any Tier 3 sponsor willing to co-sign the request, Threll said. How do I find one of those? There's a directory, Threll said, and then, after a pause that Marcus would later decide was the closest thing to an apology he got from anyone at the Compact that week, added, most of them don't respond to Tier 9 inquiries. I'm sorry, I know that's not useful. It wasn't. Marcus thanked him anyway, because Threll, unlike Owen, had at least sounded like he meant it, and because 12 years of citations had also taught him that the people lowest in a system were often the ones who hated it the most, and the least able to do anything about it. Then he went back down to Verarak 9 alone, which was against 3 separate regulations, and walked into the ship again. The interior of the vessel, Marcus had started, privately, calling it God's Fall, because on the 4th day Talia had found a section of wall that resolved, and under the right light angle, into a symbol that looked enough like a name that everyone needed to call it something. Heart, and God's Fall had come out of Cho's mouth as a joke that stopped being a joke. The interior of God's Fall did not behave like a museum. It behaved like something that had simply been waiting. The corridors lit as he walked them and dimmed behind him. The air recycled itself into something breathable within the first 100 meters, a fact that had terrified him the first time he'd noticed his suit's atmospheric warning going quiet on its own. The deeper chambers held consoles that didn't look like controls so much as invitations, smooth interfaces with markings that shifted, very slightly, when he stood close, as if the ship were trying out different alphabets to see which one he'd recognize. He didn't recognize any of them, but on the 6th day, standing in what he'd started to think of as the bridge, he'd pressed his palm flat against the central console, the way he'd pressed it against the outer hull. And the ship had answered him the same way. A voice, not a sound exactly, more like a sound arriving after the meaning had already landed. A query, it said, in something close enough to standard Union that he understood it on the first pass. Intent. I don't know what you're asking, Marcus had said. Hi, you are the fourth to stand here in this cycle of the ship's watch. The first two were turned away at the outer hull. You were not, query. Intent turned away how? The hull does not open for acquisition. The heart, it opens for curiosity without appetite for ownership. High, this has been the threshold since the founders set it. It is not a measurement of species, it is a measurement of want. Marcus had stood with that for a long moment. I want to know what you are, he'd said finally. I want to know why nobody's supposed to be allowed to know that. Here, the console had gone quiet for 4 seconds, which felt somehow like the ship thinking. That is an acceptable intent, it said. Ready when you are. He hadn't told the crew about the voice for 2 more days. Some things you have to carry alone for a little while before you can hand them to anyone else. Cho understood that without being told when Marcus finally did tell him. Cho was like that. Talia was the one who eventually made everyone slow down and document properly. Because left to himself, Marcus would have kept walking deeper into the ship on instinct alone. Talia had spent enough years cataloguing salvage sites to know that instinct without a record was just a story nobody could later prove. She mapped the accessible sections room by room, a chamber that seemed to exist purely to hold suspended crystalline structures whose function nobody could guess at. A corridor whose walls warmed slightly whenever more than one person stood in it at once, as if counting, a room with no visible light source at all, where the console simply refused to answer any question until asked a second time, in a different order. It's not being difficult, she said, the first time it happened to her. Hi. I think it's testing whether you meant the question. She wrote that down too. By the 3rd week she had 40 pages of notes that read less like a salvage log and more like a field journal from someone studying a very old, very patient animal that had chosen for reasons of its own to let itself be observed. The weapon systems were the first thing Marcus asked about, once he trusted the console enough to ask it hard questions. God's Fall carries defensive and deterrent armament consistent with Founder-era design specification. Told him, full inventory available on request, current status, dormant, unarmed, awaiting activation authority. How long has it been dormant? 11,406 years standard. Marcus sat with that number, the way you sit with something too large to actually hold. Hard. Why didn't you defend yourself when the ridge came down on top of you? I was not attacked. I was left. The founders did not fall in battle here. They chose to end their watch and set the ship to sleep until it was found by someone who asked the right question instead of taking the right thing. What's the right question? If you are asking it now, why did they leave? Hide. The founders, they did not believe permanence was a kindness. They watched the shape their presence made in the systems around them. The way younger species began building around what the founders wanted, instead of what those species wanted for themselves. They judged this a slower kind of harm than conquest, and harder to undo because it asked for no resistance. So they withdrew. They left doors instead of successors. A door only opens the room to whoever is already asking the right question. A successor makes everyone ask the founders questions forever. Marcus had turned that over for a long moment, standing in a chamber, built by something that had apparently spent its last centuries thinking harder about power than most Union High Council sessions managed in a year. Hi. That's a very convenient philosophy for something that also happens to own the biggest gun in the galaxy. Heart. It is not convenient, it is expensive. We could have simply told younger species what to build. It would have been faster. Faster was not the founder's priority. Slower and freely chosen was. You keep saying we, habit, the ship said, and for the only time in that entire conversation, something in the phrasing felt less like a database and more like a person choosing not to finish a sentence. Hi. I carry enough of them that the distinction stops mattering after a few thousand years. Hi. Later that same day, and this was the part Marcus would replay in his head for the rest of his life, a part that turned an 11,000-year-old artifact into something he could not, in good conscience, hand over to the same review board that had taken 14 months to schedule a follow-up visit. He asked the ship what else it knew. The console lit the entire chamber at once, not one screen, every wall a map unfolding star by star by star, wrapping the room, thousands of points of light, each one tagged in a clean, readable notation that meant, roughly, here too. How many, Marcus said. 4,211 confirmed sites, the ship answered. Estimated actual total, significantly higher. 4,211 doors, like the one that had opened for him. Locked, all of them, behind the same threshold. Not species, not rank, not tier. Want. Without appetite for ownership, Marcus stood in the middle of that map for a long time, thinking about a 14-month wait for a Tier 3 assessment team, and an 11-week wait for 2 directorates to agree on a signature. And a girl on Tamsin's Reach he had never met and never would, whose fever he could not personally do one single thing about. But he could do something about the next 11 weeks. And the one, to that, he was still turning that thought over 3 days later when Cho found him on the bridge, out of breath, in a way engineers who spend their lives in zero-atmosphere corridors rarely were. I've got a ship, Cho said. Not Own's fleet, something smaller. It came in dark, no beacon. Sat at the edge of the system for 6 hours running passive scans and just left again. A salvage rival, registered hull matched a shell company out of the Halveth cluster. I ran it 3 times to be sure. Cho hesitated, which was unusual for him. The shell company's parent is a Kesh mining conglomerate. One, with a standing contract to supply the Directorate's own assessment fleet. Permanent. Marx sat with that for a moment. They're not waiting 14 months. They're not waiting at all. My guess, and it's just a guess, Threll's exception directory isn't as private as the Compact thinks it is. Somebody with the right access saw your request, recognized what unprecedented scale probably meant, and decided the smart move was a quiet extraction crew instead of a 14-month queue. If they get confirmed readings before you go public, they've got a legal argument for prior discovery rights that has nothing to do with you at all. Marcus had assumed until that moment that he had months to decide what to do with what he'd found. He had at most days, and possibly, if the dark ship came back with a crew instead of a scanner, considerably less than that. I wanted quiet, Marcus said slowly. So quiet's the one thing I'm not going to give them. Sarah looked up. You're moving the broadcast up tonight, Marcus said, before they come back with more than a scanner. That was the night he stopped filing reports and started writing the broadcast instead. The Kesh Directorate found out about Godsfall the same way everyone else did, all at once, publicly, in a transmission Marcus sent on every open Union channel he could reach, unencrypted, time-stamped, impossible to quietly bury. He kept it short. Talia had helped him cut it down from 11 minutes to under 3. On the theory that nobody finishes an 11-minute broadcast from a stranger, but everyone finishes a 3-minute one out of morbid curiosity alone. This is Marcus Hale, Tier 9 Union Salvage Compact. 9 days ago, I filed a discovery report for an intact precursor vessel at Verarak 9. That report was logged and shelved for 14 months pending secondary verification. In that 14 months, a Colony 6 systems from here lost residents waiting 11 weeks for 2 directorates to agree on a medical signature. I am not filing another report. I am showing you what I found, because the alternative is trusting the same desks that produced both of those numbers. He'd let the feed cut to raw scanner footage after that, the hull, the corridor, the amber light, a map of 4,211 sites unfolding across the chamber walls. No narration over it. He wanted people to sit with the size of it the way he had. What he did not put in the broadcast, because there was no way to say it without sounding like a threat he didn't mean, was that God's Fall's weapon systems were still fully dormant. He wanted that to matter more than the ship's size did. He had no way of knowing. Yet whether it would, the response arrived faster than 14 months. It arrived in 6 hours in the form of a Union enforcement fleet, 11 vessels, Kesh-flagged, dropping out of transit at the edge of the Verarak system, with weapons systems hot, and a formal demand for Marcus Hale's immediate surrender, along with, in language that took 4 paragraphs to say what could have been said in one, vessel he had discovered. Cho read that message out loud too. He looked up when he finished it. They want the ship. I know, Marcus said. They're going to take it whether we say yes or no. I know that too. Sarah was already at the helm, hands hovering over controls, that on the mule. Would have done exactly nothing against 11 warships. So what's the plan? Marcus looked past her, out through the ridge line, at the shape rising out of the ash, like something that had simply been waiting its whole existence for someone to ask it the right question. We're not going to fight them, he said. We're going to let them look at what they're threatening. And we're going to see if that changes anyone's math. Fleet Commander Seravan Own, a cousin, distantly, to the sub-registrar, who'd signed Marcus's 14-month notice, though neither of them would ever learn, that brought her flagship to within visual range of God's Fall's exposed hull and held position there for 11 minutes without issuing a single order. Her tactical officer finally broke the silence. Commander, orders. Own didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the scale readout, watching it recalibrate the way Marcus's had, watching a section she'd filed mentally as large installation resolve, against the terrain. Heart into something the size of a hangar bay, and then the number kept climbing and climbing, until it stopped at 14 kilometers of exposed hull over a buried mass her sensors couldn't fully resolve. The largest ship in her fleet was 600 meters. Her tactical officer, a younger Kesh named Idran, who had never fired on anything larger than a smuggling skiff, was doing the same Mathone was, and getting to the same uncomfortable place. Commander, if that hull is armed anywhere close to its scale implies, I know what it implies. Idran. Then respectfully, why are we still holding position instead of requesting reinforcement before we open any channel at all? Own didn't answer right away. Appalled, she was thinking about her own record, 31 years without an unauthorized engagement, a career built on the specific, unglamorous skill of not being the officer who escalated something that didn't need escalating. He had also once, 6 years earlier, sat in a smaller room and argued that Tier 9 species deserved a faster path upward through the compact. and watched 8 colleagues vote her down without much discussion, and she had never quite decided whether that memory belonged in this moment or not. "Because," she said finally, "reinforcement takes 9 days to arrive, and I would like to know what we're dealing with before then. Not after. Hold position," she said. "Open a channel to the salvager." Marcus took the call from God's Falls Bridge. Standing, no crew behind him, the ship's interfaces glowing quietly on every wall the way they always did now, patient and unbothered by 11 warships parked outside. "Commander," he said, "you are in violation of Salvage Statute 12, Owen said. There was no heat in it. It was the same flat, correct, procedural tone Marcus had spent 12 years learning to hate. And for one strange second he almost respected how consistently the Union applied it, all the way up and down its own chain, to everyone equally unlucky enough to be beneath it. "Hammond, you are ordered to power down all systems and prepare to be boarded." "I'm not going to do that. Then I am authorized to use force. You can try," Marcus said, and he meant it as a statement of fact, not a dare. "I want to be clear about something first, though, Commander, because I don't think anyone on your side has actually looked at the numbers yet. Hi. This ship has weapon systems 11,000 years old that have never been activated in my presence. Not once, not even now, with your fleet sitting outside my hull. I haven't touched them. I'm not going to. That's not a threat I'm choosing not to make. It's a door I'm choosing not to open." He let that sit for a second. "But you should probably ask your tactical officer what she thinks 11 of your ships would do against something that size. If I changed my mind, because I think you already know the answer, and I think that's the only reason this channel is still open, instead of you already giving the order." Silence on the other end, for 4 full seconds. Owen did not know, and would not learn until much later, that the ship's threshold protocol, the same one that had let Marcus in and turned away 2 others before him, would have refused to arm itself for an act of first aggression, no matter who gave the order. She spent that silence, assuming the threat was real. It changed what she did next just as much as if it had been. "Stand by," she said, finally, and closed the channel. She did not fire. She held position for 6 more hours, running every scan her fleet could manage. Watching the broadcast Marcus had sent spread across every Union news relay faster than any Kesh statement could catch up to it. Watching public commentary from a dozen member species split into 2 camps with a speed that suggested most of them had been waiting a long time for a reason to have this argument. Some called him a terrorist. Within the same news cycle, the Meridian Assembly issued a formal statement calling him a liberator. Marcus would learn later that both labels arrived on the same day from the same event, and that this was apparently normal. Everyone who changes something without permission gets called both. A second word just takes longer to catch up. Talia tracked the commentary anyway, out of habit, the same way she tracked everything. The Tara Shipping Consortium filed a formal complaint about market disruption within the first hour. The Frontier Coalition of 11 independent stations, none of them union members, issued a joint statement that said, in its entirety, "Finally someone did the math out loud." A retired Kessa fleet admiral, 3 interviews deep by the second day, kept repeating the same sentence to every host who asked her opinion. The interesting question isn't what he found, it's what he didn't do with it. Until it started showing up as a caption under half the broadcast's replays. None of it changed anything on the bridge. Marcus read maybe 1/10 of it before he stopped. Because none of it was the fleet moving, and the fleet moving was the only commentary that mattered yet. Owen's final report to the Kesh High Council, filed 6 hours after first contact, was 3 sentences long. The target vessel confirmed intact. Minimum 14 kilometers exposed mass. Weapon systems dormant and unengaged despite provocation. Recommend against forced engagement pending council directive. Recommend diplomatic contact. The dark ship from the mining conglomerate never came back. The Co. tracked its registration for another 2 months out of professional curiosity and found that the shell company had been quietly dissolved. 11 days after Marcus's broadcast went public. The kind of clean, fast paperwork the Compact somehow always managed when it was covering for itself instead of helping someone else. Nobody was ever charged with anything. Marcus hadn't expected them to be. He'd only needed to be louder than they were quiet. And for once, the math had worked out in his favor instead of against it. The fleet withdrew 4 days later, not because anyone had won a battle, nobody had fired a shot. It withdrew because 11 warship captains had each, independently, run the same math Marcus had wanted them to run, high, and every version of that math came out the same way. There was no version of this where force produced a better outcome for the Union than the one currently on the table, a part which was a very good story about restraint, sitting in front of several trillion people, high that nobody in the Directorate wanted to be the one to end with a body count. Cho found him on the bridge the night after the fleet left and sat on the floor near the main console. Because nobody sat in the chairs on God's Falls Bridge, the geometry was built for spines that weren't human, hard, and everyone had learned that the hard way within the first week. High. He looked at Marcus's scanner readout without really looking at it, the way people do when they're working up to a different question. The Union's calling you a terrorist, Cho said. I know you know that. The Meridian Assembly's calling you a liberator. 2, same week. Strange combination. Everyone who changes something without asking gets both, Marcus said. The second one just takes longer to arrive. Cho was quiet for a moment. Are you sure you did the right thing? Marcus looked at the console, at markings he could almost read now, 4 months into learning an alphabet built by something 11,000 years dead. No, he said. I'm sure I did the only thing I was willing to do. That's different. Cho nodded, set his scanner down, picked it back up again. A habit Marcus recognized now as Cho thinking with his hands instead of his mouth. The weapon systems are still. I know you're not. I just wanted to hear you say it. I yelled. I just want to know they're there, Marcus admitted. That's different from wanting to use them. Cho nodded again, and that apparently was enough for him. It was the most Cho had ever asked for in one sitting, just to know the capable thing existed, even if nobody was going to touch it. Marcus understood that better than he could have explained. Hyman, he'd been carrying the same weight since the first day he'd stood on this bridge, and felt a wall answer his hand. The 6 weeks that followed were stranger than the fleet standoff had been in their own quiet way. There was no more shooting to not do, no more math to make anyone run, just the low hum of a galaxy deciding, one committee session at a time, what to do about a problem that had declined to be a problem in the way anyone expected. Sarah fielded 1,100 interview requests in the first 10 days and answered exactly none of them, on Marcus's instruction, because the one thing he was certain would go badly was letting the story get told second-hand before he'd finished deciding what it actually was. Natalia kept documenting. Cho kept the Mule stabilizer clunking along in low orbit nearby, because some habits were worth keeping, even when the ship it belonged to had become functionally. Footnote: parked next to something 14 kilometers long. Pi. Marcus mostly stayed on the bridge, learning the alphabet, asking God's fall questions that had nothing to do with weapons or maps. What the crystalline chamber was for, whether the founders had families, whether family was even a concept that translated. Hand. Some of the ship's answers were satisfying. Most of them just opened 3 more questions in the place of the one he'd closed, which he was starting to suspect was the entire design philosophy of the place. A dignitary arrived 6 weeks after that, a single diplomatic vessel, small, clean, Kesh flagged. Envoy Gaston, tall, grey-skinned, with the exact careful posture of someone whose entire career had been spent measuring the distance between what they meant and what they were required to say. Marcus received him alone, in the first chamber, the ship's interfaces alive on every wall. He wore the same work clothes he always wore. It was a choice so deliberate, it was almost a sentence of its own. Heart. The High Council has authorized me to offer the following, Gaston said, and then he laid it out, in order. The way you'd lay out a contract you'd already decided the other party couldn't afford to refuse. Full amnesty, retroactive clearance of every charge tied to what the Directorate was now calling, high in its internal filings, the information dissemination event. A reinstatement of his salvage license, not at Tier 9. A senior grade. That's generous, Marcus said. What's the part you're actually here for? A pause calibrated to land. Hammond, a permanent seat on the Union High Council, representing Earth, the first such seat in the history of the Council. Arthur, 62 years of being handed the bottom rung, and here was the top of the ladder, arm extended. The Council recognizes, Gaston went on, that the current structural arrangement has been suboptimal with regard to Earth's representation. This would correct that. One of Gaston's 2 aides, standing rigid near the chamber entrance, spoke for the first time, not to Marcus, but to Gaston, in the clipped tone of someone reciting a briefing point they'd been told to insert exactly here. A penvoy. The offer is also, functionally, the fastest available path to placing an observer inside the vessel's operational chain of command. High. Gaston's expression didn't change, but something in his posture tightened, as if the aide had said the true part of the sentence slightly too plainly for the room. Marcus looked between them. That's honest, at least, more honest than the rest of it. It is a mutually beneficial arrangement, Gaston said, recovering the register. Earth gains standing it has waited 62 years for. The Council gains a stable, cooperative point of contact for a discovery it has every legal right to be concerned about. Tamzin's reach gains what exactly, Marcus said, while I'm busy being your stable point of contact? Gaston paused. The colony's situation was a jurisdictional failure. Regrettable, already under internal review. 11 weeks of review killed a child. How long does internal review usually take? Aide didn't answer that one. Neither did Gaston. Not directly. The chamber went quiet. Marcus thought about Owen, the sub-registrar, and the 14-month wait. He thought about Raina Calloway's daughter, whose name he had memorized the day the report finally confirmed it. Nadia Calloway, age 8, died on the 9th day of the outbreak, before the joint signature arrived, and about the seat, and about what you actually did once you were sitting in it. He thought about it seriously. The way you think about something you want badly enough that you have to be careful with it. Harmot. You become the table, that was the thing nobody warned you about. You sat in that chair long enough, and the chair got into you. Akatha. You started drawing the same lines everyone before you had drawn, deciding the same things were necessary. looking at a medical convoy and thinking jurisdiction instead of thinking 8 years old. Hi, not because you were corrupt, because that was what the room did to the people inside it. No, Marcus said. Gaston didn't blink. The council wants the ship. If they can't have the ship, I want you inside the fence, which is the next best thing. I'm not interested in being inside the fence. Then what do you want? For one unguarded second, the diplomatic register slipped, and underneath it was something real. Not anger, not contempt, genuine incomprehension. What could you possibly want that this doesn't offer? It was a fair question. Marcus had been asked it before, by the ship itself, on the first day, and he still didn't have a clean answer. What he had was something smaller and harder to hold. He parked Godsfall 3 weeks later, not on Verarak 9, in neutral space, along a drift corridor 6 light years from the nearest Union boundary, lie in a stretch of nothing nobody had ever found useful enough to claim. He held position and opened a broadcast on every channel again. He kept it even shorter this time. Godsfall is here, he said. It will remain here. Under human watch. It will not attack anyone. It will not be surrendered to anyone. He paused. A car. It is not a weapon, it is a witness. He closed the broadcast. Sarah looked over from the comm array. A witness to what? That we had it, Marcus said, and we didn't use it to take anything. The bridge was quiet for a moment. Some species won't understand that, Cho said. Some will think it's a trap, Talia added, not looking up from the record she was writing. A permanent. Some will eventually understand it. Eventually, Marcus said, and let that be the whole answer. Because eventually was the only honest metric available for anything that actually mattered. You put a thing like this in the ground, and you trusted it would grow toward the light. It might grow some direction you hadn't modeled instead. Either way, the seed was in the ground. Either way, you were done standing over it, waiting to see. Rayna, Calloway heard the second broadcast 11 days after it aired, on a relay that reached Tamsin's Reach later than it reached almost anywhere else in the Union. Because Tamsin's Reach had never been anyone's priority for fast infrastructure. She listened to it. Twice she did not cry, because she had done most of her crying already. In the 6 days between the fever starting and the day it ended, and there hadn't been much left over by the time the joint signature finally arrived. 12 hours after Nadia died, a fact the Directorate's condolence message had not mentioned, and Rayna had not needed it to. What she did instead was find the drawing of the fox still taped to the wall by the bed, and she photographed it, and she sent it, unprompted, unasked, to an open channel address that half of Union space had bookmarked by then, with 3 words attached. This is why Marcus never met her. He kept that image anyway, in a folder he didn't show anyone, next to a number he'd never stop knowing. 11 weeks. The joint session that had originally been scheduled 11 weeks out never actually convened on schedule. It didn't need to. Within 9 days of Marcus's first broadcast, with public attention on the Directorate at a level no internal memo could survive, the Kesh Health Directorate and the Union Frontier Authority produced a joint emergency signature in 4 hours for a second outbreak on a different colony, in a different system, that nobody outside the 2 directorates had ever expected to move that fast. Rayna heard about it from Vren, the physician, who told her without being asked, because he understood, better than most people, exactly what she needed to hear and exactly why it would hurt to hear it. 4 hours, she repeated. That's what it takes. When people are watching, yes, Vren said. She didn't say anything else for a while. There wasn't a version of that sentence that came out sounding like anything other than what it was. Hard. 2 months later, a 9-year-old boy on that second colony walked out of the clinic on his own legs. Fever broken, 4 days after the treatment arrived instead of 11 weeks after it didn't. And nobody there knew Nadia's name. They didn't need to. The signature that saved him had her death folded into it somewhere. Unrecorded, uncredited, the way most of the actual cost of any given policy change usually is. That first night in the drift corridor, with the crew asleep and the ship's heartbeat running steady under a sky, with no cloud cover and no atmospheric scatter to soften it, just stars, dense and clean, the kind you only see from the exact middle of nowhere, Marcus stood alone at the main console. "What do you want now?" "Hi." The ship asked him, the same question Gaston had asked, a completely different weight. He looked at the stars. For a long time they didn't move. Not on any scale a single human being could watch happen. They just burned, patient and numerous, through whatever fuel they had, for as long as they had it, without asking anyone whether it was worth it. "Show me what else the Founders left," he said. The map came up again, every wall of the chamber at once. 4,211 confirmed points of light, and beneath that number, one more line he hadn't noticed the first time. Estimated actual total, significantly higher. Full survey requires participation beyond current crew capacity. Marcus stood in the middle of it. He was 34 years old. He had a cracked co-pilot seat with peeling cargo tape, a salvage rig that made a noise when she flew, and 6 people he trusted with most things. He had a ship that was 14 kilometers of patient, waiting capability and a galaxy that was currently, loudly, arguing about what to do with a man who had handed it a library card instead of a weapon. "How do we open the rest?" he asked. "To everyone, not just us. That is an acceptable intent." Harded. The ship said. "Ready when you are," he thought, standing there, about the version of this night that would have existed if he'd taken Gaston's offer instead. A seat at the High Council. A Godsfall quietly absorbed into a Directorate Asset Registry. The map of 4,211 doors handed to the same 9 tiers that had taken 14 months to schedule a follow-up visit to one of them. A permanent been easier. It would have felt, for a while, like winning. He didn't think it would have stayed feeling that way for very long. And he was fairly sure he wouldn't have been able to tell the difference between the day it stopped and the day he stopped noticing. He preferred this version, not because it was safer. Nothing about parking an 11,000-year-old warship in neutral space and inviting every species in the Union to come look at. It was safer than staying quiet would have been. He preferred it because it was the version where, 9 years from now or 90, nobody would be able to say that humanity got the ladder pulled up behind it the moment it finally reached the top rung. That was worth more to him than the seat had ever been. It had just taken him a while, standing in a room built by something that measured its patience in millennia. To say so out loud. 9 years later, on a research outpost built into the shell of the 3rd confirmed site, opened under Joint Union-Human Charter, a charter that had taken 4 years of argument to draft. And that Marcus had refused to sign until it named every member species as equal custodian. Above another. Tier system abolished from the document entirely. A young archivist named Priani sat with a recording pulled from the public record and asked her instructor the question. Everyone eventually asked, sooner or later, once they'd read far enough into the file. Did he give it away? He could have kept it. He could have made humans the only ones with the map. Her instructor, who had been a child on Tamsin's Reach the year the second broadcast went out, Apan, and who kept a photograph of a fox drawing in a drawer she didn't open often, thought about the question for a moment before she answered it the way she always did. Hi. Because he was asked once what he wanted, she said, and it took him 9 years to work out that the answer was never a seat at the table. Hi. It was making sure the table stopped mattering. Priyani frowned at that, the way you frown at an answer that's true but hasn't finished landing yet. Heart. That's not really an answer, no, her instructor agreed. Would you have taken the seat? Ha. Her instructor considered the question longer than Priyani expected, long enough that the recording on the desk between them cycled back to its opening frame. The ash-grey ridgeline of Verarak 9, amber light spilling out through an open hull. Hi, I think about that more than I'd like to admit, she said finally. Hi was 8, same as her, if someone offered me a table that would have kept the next Nadia Calloway alive. I don't know that I'd have said no as cleanly as he did. Heart, but you said it doesn't matter what he wanted. You said it mattered that the table stopped mattering. Both things are true at once. That's usually how the real ones work. She reached over and closed the file, a ridge line, and the amber light both fading from the screen. Up. Go read Site 4040. There's a door there nobody's opened yet. Maybe it's waiting on you to ask it the right question. No, her instructor agreed. It's a witness.